Okay. Well, I appreciate being here. I wish I could be there in South Dakota with you. So I'll give this the best shot that I can. But we're going to go through some, how to think about trade, how to think about industrial strategy with manufacturing and agriculture, and maybe some things you can think about going forward to make a difference at the end. So I'm going to ask for the next slide. So just many of you have seen me before. I've been at the RCAF convention before, but just a reminder who CPA is, the Coalition for a Prosperous America. We are a coalition of manufacturers, workers, farmers, and ranchers. RCAF is a member. Bill Bullard is on the board. We also have manufacturers and organized labor on the board. We have Democrats and Republicans. We represent, through our associations and companies, over 4 million households. And again, it's bipartisan or cross ideology, because balancing trade, fixing trade, and fixing American prosperity is not a partisan issue or an ideological issue. So we have Republicans, Democrats, independents, and everything across the board. And so next slide, please. So our overall goals are a national trade and economic strategy to eliminate the trade deficit, create good paying jobs, and achieve broadly shared prosperity in the U.S. Now we are not free traders. We do not think free trade gets you there. Free trade, we think, gets you cheap consumption and no jobs and little income. And so that's the chief difference, in that we, as bullet point 3 says, we focus upon production as the source of national strength and well-being. In other words, we believe jobs and purchasing power are the source of national wealth and national strength, rather than your ability to get cheap consumption. And rather than the global trade dynamic being sort of trade partners and we're holding hands together, they're competitors. And every country, if they don't understand it, or some do, but the US doesn't understand that we are actually in a global competition for goods, jobs, and industries. That's the core of it, a global competition for good jobs and industries. China knows they're in that competition. Germany knows. We don't tend to know it, or a lot of our leaders don't tend to know that we're in that competition, which is why we tend to create jobs mostly in the areas of restaurant and food service, tourism, and home health aides. Ask for the next slide, please. So here's some issues we've been working on. These are the top line issues with a bunch of projects under it. But trade enforcement to fix trade cheating. So when other countries subsidize or to transship or to cheat at customs, we work on those issues. We're pro-tariff to grow industry sectors when other countries cheat or when they subsidize. You can either try to out-cheat them or out-subsidize, or you can just negate it with tariffs. We think tariffs is effective. Tariffs are effective to negate their cheating, and it doesn't cost us. In fact, they pay our treasury to do so. Tariffs are also important for a strategy when you want certain industries here, and you just want to shield them from any country that either is better than you or is subsidized better than you or is cheating to get better than you. Any of it, you just want the industry here. So that includes national security industries. Exchange rates is a huge issue for us. It's a huge issue for beef producers, which I'll show you later. We have a dollar overvalued by 27 to 30%, and that is putting a huge downward pressure on our ability to sell our manufactured goods overseas and our agricultural goods, as well as our goods in the U.S., because imports are far cheaper when our dollar is too overvalued. We favor an industrial strategy. Now, it used to be industrial strategy, industrial policy was dismissed as some, Soviet era, planning scenario, but now we've realized, or many in the government has anyway, we realized at CPA some time ago that Japan had a plan, they executed it, and they developed into a rich country. So does South Korea. So did Germany, so did the US in the 1800s, and so is China with Chinese characteristics these days. You don't get anywhere without a plan or industrial strategy. You got to have one. So we want to make industrial strategy cool again. Next, we like Buy American programs from the government and labeling for the consumers, and to increase the consumer propensity to be able to identify what's made in America and also to want to buy it. But government procurement's a big issue these days with COVID and medical supplies and equipment. Lastly, we have folks on tax strategies that discourage offshoring and don't discourage onshoring. We don't want our tax policy to encourage offshoring, which many of them do right now. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is a basic tier of trade thinking, and over another slice of it. And I've shown this slide at RCAF before, but it bears repeating. You don't see this in Bloomberg or Forbes or Fortune magazine or the Times or the Journal. But when they say tariffs are going to kill trade, it's garbage. It doesn't kill trade, it shifts it around. So overall, when trade grows over the long term. Well, we've had some long-term advances in shipping and containerization, but basically, when countries grow around the world, when there's global growth, you get more trade. You get more domestic growth, you get more trade, period. Exchange rates don't make a big difference on global volume of trade, and neither do tariffs. So when the WTO people say tariffs are going to kill trade and trade volumes will go down, they're wrong. They don't have data to support them. The balance or imbalance of trade, and this is where we have departed a little bit, from some in government now. Tariffs don't really fix the balance of trade. It's really exchange rates. So our dollar is overvalued. It's too expensive. Other countries, especially surplus countries, who I'll show you soon, are surplus countries that produce more than they consume and offload their overproduction to us. They have undervalued currencies. And an over and undervalued currency is based upon whether it's a competitive value, which is one that will balance your overall trade multilaterally with everyone. So you have a basic balance. And so the dollar's been overvalued for many years for reasons including we're the biggest reserve currency. We're the reserve currency in the world. Everyone pays with dollars. We have massive financial sector sucking in capital from around the world. All that capital coming in pushes our dollar value up too high in a way that can't balance our trade, and which deindustrializes us and hurts agriculture. Lastly is the composition of trade, and this is where trade agreements, subsidies, industrial strategy, tariffs all live. Composition of trade. It's not the balance, but if you tariff steel or aluminum, you'll get less of that, which is good for those industries because we want them, and we haven't seen any inflation from steel products now after the first bump. So we want those, but tariffs on those sectors will tend to get less steel and aluminum, but overall the balance of trade won't change. And we've seen that in the last 3 years. If you tariff something, you'll get less of that. If you subsidize something, you might export more of it or sell more of it domestically, deter imports, but your overall balance of trade won't work or won't change. Now that's a good thing to do, is to concentrate on the composition of trade, because we'd rather sell more value-added goods than low-value goods. There's certain sectors you want, so the composition of your economy is really important. But it's different than the balance of trade and the overall volume of trade. And these are irrefutable facts. The thing is, the trade reporters, the economic reporters, and even the economists tend not to acknowledge these things, and they tend to talk in ways that don't make sense once you understand this. Next slide, please. Okay, so the global imbalances, the U.S. is the consumer of last resort for the world. We're providing the consumer demand for everyone else who overproduces. So rather than a world of scarcity like we thought we grew up in, we're in a world of glut where there's too many goods chasing too few consumers. And those surplus countries are primarily, the big ones are China, Germany, Japan, and Korea. They overproduce, they underconsume, and so they ship all their goods, their excess goods, and their unemployment to deficit countries like the U.S. So Germany produces for its own citizens and excessively relies on other, peripheral Europe and the U.S. for its employment. And Yeah, so does China, so does Japan, so does Korea. They're those big surplus countries. I'll show you in a chart soon. The big deficit countries are US, UK, not so much Spain, Portugal, Greece anymore because they've crashed and they're not consuming so much overseas. But US, UK, Australia, they're big open economies that tend to think the whole world's free trade, and it's not. Welcome all the capital from the rest of the world, and that flood of capital, that's another glut. There's a glut of goods, there's a glut of capital. I know it's hard to believe there's a glut of capital when we're a little short of it in our own bank account, but overall there is, and that's why the stock market's hitting new highs. The glut of foreign capital is pouring into the US, driving our dollar up, driving the stock market up, because there's so much capital out there that's chasing too few safe or productive or proper assets, non-speculative assets. It's just inflating the dollar value, it's inflating the stock market value, and it's been doing the dollar for about 40 years. And so that's why you wonder, well, why is the stock market going up? It's because all the central banks in the world and all the capital creation around the world doesn't have enough places to go, so it goes into US Treasury bonds, US stock market, and making what when you read in this Wall Street Journal, this stock went up, and they start analyzing the company's performance or not, it's kind of irrelevant anymore because it's overall global supply and demand of capital. In any event, next slide, you can see what happens, that above that line are the surplus countries, which are the primary ones. Are Germany, China, Japan. South Korea should be in there, and then there's a collection of others. Those are the countries above the line that are overproducing. They're producing more than their citizens consume on net. This isn't a critique of trade at all. I mean, you consume some, you sell some, you buy some, and overall, countries should tend toward a current account or a trade balance. If they don't, there's a structural imbalance that keeps going because of exchange rates aren't working like they should. Now, the U.S. is under that line. It's that light green bar. So we are the primary consumer of last resort. When they can't sell it elsewhere, they sell it to us, or they sell it to us first. However you want to see it, we have the job of consuming everyone else's oversupply. And it takes out our agriculture, parts of it, our net imports, commodities such as beef and cattle. It takes out our manufacturing, and we do have transition of jobs when we kill our manufacturing, but it transitions from good paying manufacturing jobs where you can have a 40-hour week, benefits, and retire with dignity, into part-time jobs with low wages. You don't get enough hours, you don't get enough wages, you don't get enough benefits, and your home health aides, again, your tourism, your restaurant, food service, that sort of thing. So that's the type of country we're becoming, is a food service tourism country, rather than China, which has an industrial strategy like China 2025 to dominate the industries of the future, whether it's AI, transportation, robotics, various things, and they're actually doing it because they have a plan. We don't. So this is a big, in some ways, this chart you're looking at is the crucial metric for U.S. prosperity. If we could get our imbalance to zero, we would have disproportionately impact manufacturing, natural resources, and agriculture, and we would put a lot of people back to work. 5 million or plus, which our study I'll go into that we did shows us. But this is the big chart, and the politicians that are talking about trade agreements and export opportunities, and they see this performance over the last 30, 40 years have showed that our trade international market share goes down and our domestic market share is way down. They've got to conclude something else. And we all want jobs. We all want good incomes. This is an important chart. Next page, please. This is our bilateral trade deficits. Who's our biggest ones? And you can see bilaterally, China makes up nearly half of our overall trade deficit. A lot of these are free trade agreement countries. A lot of them are WTO countries, and it shows that getting a free trade agreement or whether it's a multilateral like the WTO or a bilateral doesn't end up in us getting more net exports, right? Net exports, meaning we're doing better exporting than we were before. And oh, by the way, it also derivatively means we're gaining market share in our domestic market. We aren't. So China's number one, Mexico. Now this since for the last few months, really the EU and Canada and Mexico have really increased. So this chart is going to look a lot different in 2020 because China's decreased a bit because of the trade wars that they started, we're responding to. But China's the big enchilada in terms of economic trade, and of course there are geopolitical competition, competitor. And there's a lot more going on in China, which this is going to be dominating, I think, maybe the rest of our lifetimes, the U.S.-China competition, because they're trying to dethrone the U.S. from a unipolar world go to a multipolar world where there's no hegemonic power, and then eventually claim China's rightful status as the world hegemonic power after the multipolar world. They're using intellectual property theft, diversion, distraction. They're taking over Hong Kong. They are brutally suppressing, people within their borders, including the Uyghurs and concentration camps. There's a lot going on. They're just not another trading country like a trade competitor like Germany or Japan. So that's a big deal. And even this week, been reading articles like they're from the 2005 about China's just another pacifist country that is trying to, gain and take, get rich. And that's not the case. There's more going on there. And hopefully, whether it's Trump that wins this election or Biden does, that there's a continuing push on China because we've been enabling them in their rise for too long. Next slide, please. So this is old data, but it shows the deindustrialization result. You can see, sorry about not updating this data, but I'm on vacation this week and didn't get to it. But the countries that have surpluses are those top four, and their manufacturing share of GDP is quite a bit higher than us. And the deficit countries, the U.S. and the U.K., don't produce. We don't produce a lot of things, and that's where you get your jobs, your innovation, your productivity, your value add. That's where you get the basis of a strong country. And so people say, well, we can't manufacture anymore. Well, we know that Germany, which has higher wages than us, and Japan, which has similar wages than us, manufacture a lot more than us as a percent of GDP. And they had an intentional plan to do so. We can do it now. And people say we can't unwind globalization the way it is. Well, we can. We can regionalize or localize it just as the other countries did when they upended the prior version of globalization or the supply chains where they were. They did it intentionally. Next slide. Okay, so here's some of Trump's tariff actions. One is under Section 201 is a temporary relief from imports that injure a domestic industry. It gives you a 4-year timeline, and clothes washers and solar panels were some tariffed industries. We just released reports now on both of them. The press was freaking out that clothes washer prices and solar prices are going to go through the roof. What tends to happen and tended to happen with steel, aluminum, clothes washers, solar panels is right around the time of tariff announcements and imposition, you had prices go, how would you say, they would go volatile, sometimes up, sometimes down, as people were front running the tariffs or stockpiling or whatever. And now 2-3 years into these tariffs, we're seeing that clothes washer, solar panel prices, they're all down below pre-tariff levels. Hot rolled coil steel is down below pre-tariff levels, okay? They're also, clothes washers, we just found, published in a report last week under the CPA economics team, that clothes washer prices are not only less than pre-tariff levels, which is a subsidized level, right? Because that's those 201 tariffs were to counteract subsidies. Also below 10-year levels, so they're even cheaper than 10 years ago. Just as you see in the cattle market, where your cattle price, which is depressed, has no relation to the consumer beef price. It should, but it doesn't. You see that in other sectors too. that an upstream, product has very little to no relation to the downstream consumer price. And so for all the bleating and screeching from the press and from all the economists that torture data in their basement at Princeton to find that consumers are harmed by the tariffs, consumers haven't noticed, and they haven't revised what they said. Inflation was flat pre-COVID. It was too flat. The only thing pushing inflation up was home prices, things you can't outsource, home prices, tuition, healthcare, that sort of thing. But otherwise, inflation was flat. So we have Section 232 tariffs, which is national security based, against steel and aluminum. And then the Section 301 is, as you can see in the chart, it's action to cause a foreign government to stop trade violations. That's where China was documented to engage in intellectual property theft, which they've done for years, but they first documented it, a couple of years back and imposed tariffs to persuade them to stop. And China refused to stop. In fact, they tariffed our products rather than stop, rather than admit they were doing wrong. So the president upped the tariffs in response, and there was that sort of thing going on. It obviously has affected China's actions in buying agricultural products, and we're probably going to have to find some way as the global market in our export-based commodities, which are our row crops, which we produce more than we consume, corn, soy, wheat, especially soy, was heavily dependent on China. As the Brazilians take over the China market and we sell where Brazil used to, we're going to have to resolve that, and probably should with some agricultural industrial strategy as well, because laissez-faire hasn't worked well, or free trade hasn't worked well, hands-off approach in row crops or manufactured goods or in livestock agriculture. So we have to decide what metrics we want to produce for the good of rural America or America itself and go after it. And that's really a message to go with forward. Next slide, please. Okay, let's get into the dollar. Now, this is the big enchilada. It's very hard. Wall Street loves a strong dollar. Wall Street loves hoovering up the world's capital into U.S. bank accounts, U.S. dollar-denominated assets to push the dollar up. But it's killing everyone else who's working for a living. It's making all our goods, services, and labor more expensive in relation to other countries than it otherwise would be. That means it hampers our exports, and then we give up our domestic market share because imports are cheaper. So the dollar, U.S. dollar, is 25 to 30% overvalued. We calculated that a year and a half ago. It may be a little more overvalued now. This is as in relation to a basket of major currencies, a cumulative basket, not as to one currency or another. And we know that weak currencies or undervalued currencies like China, Japan, South Korea, Germany. Germany is a strong economy hiding behind a weak euro. They all get a huge export advantage, and they suppress imports because with a 25%, like Germany is 25 to 30% too low for the strength of its economy. It means everything that Germany sells to the rest of the world is about 25 to 30% too cheap, cheaper than it would be with a fairly valued euro. And it means the imports have a harder time getting in. That makes Germany the biggest net exporter in the world, beating even China. At times they were at 8% of GDP in terms of a surplus, 8% of GDP, where we are a net deficit country at up to 3% of GDP. And China didn't quite make the German levels either. So Germany is out China-ing China. They just are nicer about it. But pay attention to the euro. They're offloading their excess capacity onto the U.S. And relying on us to employ their citizens and to foster their growth. So the dollar is 25 to 30% overvalued. It's caused by massive foreign capital inflows. We could go into the reasons if you like, well, later on, but they just happen. You can track them, the net capital inflows, pump up our dollar into overvalued. Market access charge is something we are keen on for a solution. which is a charge on those inflows. If everyone wants to treat the dollar as the world's reserve currency and buy dollars in order to trade, in order to invest or whatever, let's charge them a service fee for it. That will deter them, slowly bring the dollar value down and make our goods, services, and labor more competitive. Tammy Baldwin, a Democrat from Wisconsin, and Josh Hawley, a Republican from Missouri, have a bill that does this and would be indeed the closest thing to a trade silver bullet that we have. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's say we fix the overvalued dollar. With whatever we do, we wave a magic wand and move the dollar to a fairly valued level, which means a level that is intended to balance our trade flow. So we export a bunch, we import a bunch, trade a bunch, but it's basically balanced. The overall economic results are really spectacular. We conducted this study last year about what's the economic benefits for fixing our overvalued dollar. And it's bigger than anything Congress can do, both for the overall economy, for manufacturing, and for agriculture. So the economic results are overall growth increases by 1% per year. And understand, 1% sounds small until you think, well, you know what? The Congressional Budget Office is predicting, was at the time last year, growth about 2.5% per year. So you add another 1% on, and it gets pretty big. That adds up to over 5 years that the economy is $1 trillion bigger than it's forecast to be in 5 years. So that's adding from 2.5%, another percent. So that's 3.5% per year, which is a really big deal. 5.2 million more jobs are created. Now, if especially now with COVID and the economic harm from COVID as we recover, and we've lost a lot of those restaurant and tourism jobs and some other jobs too, but they were disproportionately affected. If we were to fix our overvalued dollar and do a surge in manufacturing, the disproportionate beneficiaries are manufacturing and natural resources, and those people coming back to work would have better jobs with better purchasing power, and a lot of them. And the thing is, once manufacturing and natural resources sucks up those employees and pays better, then the service sector has to pay more too at the risk. Otherwise, they're going to lose their employees to the manufacturing sector. So it's a big increase. That's why item 3, the wages and job quality increase, because they tend to be higher quality jobs, meaning more wages and full time. So you get a 40-hour week, benefits, that sort of thing, with the more manufacturing. You also get ag price increases because dollar value, as many of you know, the value of the dollar is very extremely tightly related to ag commodity prices. So even more than the value-added products like the durable goods, whether it's clothes washers or cars or services, the commodities, whether it's ag or non-ag commodities, are very sensitive to dollar movements. If you go to the next slide, I think we'll see it. Yeah, so this is a lot of wiggly lines, but let me just sort it out for you. If you go to the right of the graph there, to the more recent years, that light blue line going up is the dollar value. Okay, that's the only dollar value, dollar exchange rate line, the dollar exchange rate in relation to a basket of currencies. The other lines are a basket of ag commodity prices, several commodity prices. So there's different sensitivities. Soybeans, we believe, are a lot more sensitive to the dollar than milk and dairy, and beef is kind of in the middle. But overall, 27%, which at the time we did the study, if we realigned the dollar by 27%, made it 27% cheaper, it'd lead to a 67% price rise in ag commodity prices. And that's using Purdue research, the relationship between the dollar and ag commodity prices, and doing just simple regression studies. So it's a really big deal, and I encourage RCAF to include overvalued dollar a little more in when it's discussing remedies, not to distract from what you're already doing, but it's a pretty big deal. Next slide. Okay, now let's talk about industrial strategy a little bit and reshoring. Now that's become a big deal since COVID, when we found we didn't have enough PPE didn't have enough ventilators, don't have enough pharmaceutical products. People in the drug realm who are in us in terms of legal drugs, that is, pharmaceutical drugs, have been like Rosemary Gibson, who's one of our members. She wrote a book called China RX, which documented our excessive reliance on China for our essential medicines, our active pharmaceutical ingredients, APIs. APIs are the active ingredients that go into the pills that you may or may not take, or your relatives take, because most of the pill is not active ingredient, it's carrier, but the active ingredients come from China. We're heavily dependent in some cases for 90% of our essential medicines. These aren't the fancy medicines, the brand name, new stuff that you hear, advertised on TV. They're the generics. They're the workhorse medicines that every hospital crash cart has. A hospital crash cart is one that has, around the emergency room or an ambulance, they've got a fully stocked array of pharmaceutical products to handle about everything you need, and as well as and then of course there's antibiotics. The essential drugs are a whole category. In any event, we don't produce them. Big Pharma offshored it a long time ago, and actually China had a strategy to grab that business, and they did it. There's no reason that China has comparative advantage in the world for pharma. They just decided it was going to happen, and it did, through massive subsidies. So now we see reshoring is talked about by everyone, mostly in the terms of resiliency and supplying people for this and future pandemics. And, increasingly, we've got to be talking about reshoring these industries in order to get jobs here. They happen to be great jobs. A CPA study found earlier this year that reshoring pharmaceutical production just back to 2010 levels of imports would produce another 830,000 jobs. If you added medical devices and medical supplies and reshored that production to 2010 levels of imports, not 1900s, not 1910, just 2010 levels of imports, it's another 300,000 jobs. It's 1.1 million jobs. They happen to be good jobs. So actually the Trump administration is recognizing this. They gave a big contract to a company called Flow, P-H-L-O-W, which is one of our members, which is a USA-made pharmaceutical company that wants to produce, is producing some of those essential medicines. There's a list of 50 or 100 of these essential critical medicines. We have some other pharmaceutical companies that are, have advanced drug production tech that are in CPA, and we've actually started a health care committee with pharmaceutical, medical device, and medical supply, or PPE products, because to take advantage and guide them through this whole process of reshoring, because the government, through a grant, gave a flow of $356 million through a contract to buy their products, which gets them up to scale. So they can invest, they can get up to a scale that they can be efficient, and they don't need to go and sell their product on eBay. And this is a crucial, and I don't have a slide on this analysis, but this is a crucial analysis if you want to reshore. And I think there's some value to thinking about it in meatpacking too, and in ag commodity processing. If you set your eyes on starting, a new structure underneath the concentrated structure to service certain, geographic areas, like the recent Mountain States lamb plant that went down. But first, you need an incentive to build or incentive to reshore, whether it's tax incentives or some other, incentives to do so. Second, you need a guaranteed consumer market of a large enough volume that you can get to scale. All right, because scale economies are tremendous. You get to scale, and hopefully with the right, advanced technology to get to scale, so you're competitive. And then third, to get protection from foreign predation, because we know China wants to take over about every industry that we have here, because to employ their own people and to become, the next superpower. And other countries have their designs on us as well. And of course, in agriculture and in beef, especially, the big players are Canada and Mexico, as well as Brazil, Argentina. The point is that I bring this up is that I think it's common. We see the same thing in pharma and the medical device where they globalize. They have 4 companies dominating, and now we're seeing some reshoring because the global companies are acting in contravention of the U.S. national interest, and so much that people are dying and they can't get the stuff they need. The steel and aluminum tariffs I have here, now that's reshoring for national security, but what many people don't know is the target in the Steel 232 tariffs were to get U.S. producers. First, they just decided that steel is a national security industry and aluminum because there's such heavy military use for it. And it's also for critical, there's 16 critical infrastructure sectors, from chemical plants to electronic, to the electric grid, to transportation, et cetera, that are critical sectors for national security. Steel, aluminum supply, a lot of them. And that's why they're a national security industry. But they targeted in both steel and aluminum to get the current industry to 80% capacity. Now that's an important number because they had a metric target, and that's something could maybe be used in agriculture. You get to 80%, they chose 80% because steel was down to 70, 60, sometimes 50%, and they're not full enough for their existing plants to spread their fixed costs in order to make a profit. So get to 80% and they can run profitably. And that's why they almost got to 80% in steel, just got to 70 in aluminum, but still you saw prices drop just because they could get to a capacity that they could keep prices the same at reasonable levels and still be profitable. So that's important. Now, I have on this slide ag reshoring targets question mark. First, based on what? Rural economic security, resiliency, some quantitative targets like the 80%. And I just have suggestions here. Is there a market access for all areas kind of an issue? You document the importance of, it's well documented, the importance of beef and cattle, as well as other industries for areas. But you got to have a market access for areas. And certainly, in a lot of places we have access, but it's only to one packer. But with the lamb co-op plant going under, we don't even have access to one plant. That's threatened. Other targets could be capacity utilization or to increase the domestic producer share of the domestic market, or a certain price, maybe a certain percent of the consumer dollar. But you first have to get that justification, which is rural economic security. Do you really want, rural ghettos with broken families, with drugs, with all the problems of poverty? And you want to get these industries to a capacity where you can get, an economic floor under them. And oh, by the way, there's not a big relationship between the farm gate price and the consumer price anyway. So let's get some, let's get a plan together, because now we have some, the big thing is reshoring, albeit again in PPE and the like, but it's sort of in food where they're talking resiliency. But resiliency means that you're depending on multiple markets, not just your own. We want to go beyond resiliency to stronger dependence and basically nowadays with COVID recovery, you've got to get money in people's pockets, and let's do it through the marketplace. Now, this would be the start of a new initiative. There would be some opposition, but you got to start somewhere, and we've seen it in the manufacturing side. Methods to do so, maybe federal support for new plants, where maybe federal, I don't have on here, but federal agreements to buy it. That's what we have in the pharma sector, is some support for new plants, and then a federal commitment to buy, whether it's a Veterans Affairs buying the pharmaceutical products, Department of Defense, or the health, the HHS, which I can't remember, but it's Health and Human Services. So school lunch, military, commitments to buy at a price that a plant can be profitable. Restricting imports by tariffs or quotas, which would be designed to get, let's ratchet up the domestic producer share of the U.S. market by, let's say you got a 10% foreign share of the U.S. cattle and beef market, which I think is about right. And let's ratchet it back, 1 or 2%, per year. You get that trend line. So those are some, maybe some new ways to think about things. Maybe there's some opportunities. And so let's go to the next slide. So let's think about the election. We all know where Trump is on trade. He's been pretty aggressive in a unilateral sense because we've been the importer of last resort. CPA has largely been supportive of what Trump and his team, with Bob Lighthizer, the U.S. Trade Representative, Peter Navarro in the White House, the assistant for the Office of Director of Office of Manufacturing and Trade Policy, and in the Department of Commerce, et cetera. We've been pretty supportive because it's been a marked turn from the failed philosophy of free trade, which has offloaded our productive capacity off our shores and our jobs and our quality of our purchasing power. So the industry strategy we talked about the tariffs, reducing the trade deficit, didn't do quite so much, did with regard to China markedly. But because we didn't affect currency, we didn't overall. So the reduction in the China trade deficit has been taken up by Canada, Mexico, and the EU. Again, largely because of currency. National security as a priority for trade, and China views economic security as national security. So do other countries. We haven't so much, but Trump and Peter Navarro have been saying it more, during their administration. National security is economic security, and it is. Buy American has been important. Trump has had a Buy American, Hire American focus, and has issued executive orders in that regard. Most recently on pharmaceutical drugs, to direct government agencies to buy U.S. rather than from somewhere else. There's some fixes that need to be done for it, but so far so good. And there's, of course, been the China focus. We no longer have the pre-Trump view that China is just another developing country just trying to get rich, and it's inevitable that the U.S. can't do anything about it. We don't have any leverage because China is our banker, et cetera, et cetera. Now we know that we have the leverage because we are China's consumer market. We deprive them of that market, and they don't have enough money to keep their machine going. Biden priorities have been affected. There's a war in the Biden campaign between the old style globalists and the fair traders. So certainly they both agree on labor and environmental provisions in trade agreements. I am skeptical about how much they work, even if you have, let's just accept that labor and environmental provisions are a good thing. What you get is some potentially increased labor rights in foreign countries and environmental enforcement elsewhere, which may very well be a good thing, but it doesn't affect our wages and our market share very much. In fact, there was a study done by labor economists 3-4 years ago of 500 trade agreements with labor provisions in them, mostly between the EU and third countries, and the EU is much more dedicated to labor provisions than the US has been. And they found that the impact on workers in those countries was undetectable. So they didn't really work. But it's more of a fair trade view, which is fine. We're more of a strategic trade view. I don't think China or other countries view things in terms of fairness. They want to strategically win. Again, you remember, this is a global competition for good jobs and industries. But it's better than the globalists of Wall Street and Davos. PPE is a big priority to reshore, or at least to get resiliency. Infrastructure is a big priority, and reshore some of it. Buy American is a priority. The Biden campaign has a big document on Buy American, so that's good. They want to subsidize industries that are favored. That's fine. I think it's good to do that in many cases. We're probably not going to overall, I won't say it that way. We will never out-subsidize China. We just will not. But targeted subsidies are a part of the game. And a multilateralist approach. There has been one of my biggest critiques on the Biden side is they want to wait to get all of our partners together to confront China. But the thing is, all of our partners, many of them have a surplus with China, and they're not part of the game of great powers. So certainly allies and multilateralism has its place, but we've seen that unilateral efforts and protecting our national interests, which are goaded more by China than anyone else, has caused other countries to figure out what's happening to them as they ban Huawei, as they start doing restrictions on and pull out of some international agreements because of the takeover of Hong Kong, because of the intellectual property theft, everything that people have been ignoring and looking the other way, or a lot of it, the Uyghur concentration camps, the state-sponsored forced organ harvesting, all that is coming to the fore more than ever now, and people aren't looking the other way. And companies are being challenged now. Is it really worth doing business in China and making money off of Uyghur slave labor just for another buck? That's untenable. And whether the stock price doesn't overcome that. So so if Biden gets elected, we would have to focus from the CPA point, and I think the RCAF point of view on, look, you wanted to reshore, this is how we do it. You want PPE, this is how we do it. You want a COVID recovery, you get these industries back, and these are, but the laissez-faire free trade view of the past is going to interfere with that. It's going to be counter to that. So this would be our hook. If you want to get more votes in rural America, you got to have a plan for an agro-industrial strategy that gets a price and income to farmers and ranchers. And so if Trump is in, we'll continue building on the shakeup of the old trade paradigm that we have. So we'll see in the fall, but that's an analysis of the camps. But I know in the Biden camp, there's a big knife fight going on between the globalists and the fair traders. So we'll see, we'll see. I don't suppose none of them will win. It'll just be a battle by battle scenario of who gets the upper hand here or there. So that's my presentation, and I don't know how you handle questions, but that's it for me. Thank you.
Anyone have questions right quickly for Michael? Okay, hold on, time out. I'm sorry, Vaughn, I couldn't say yes.
Fine, you walked right by another one, I'm sorry. Recently with COVID-19 and the pandemic, we've seen wild fluctuations in box beef. What would be your thoughts or comments on, there's been suggestions of trying to figure out a way to tie the cash live market to box beef or base it off of our box beef. Are we asking for something that we might not really wish we get, or what's your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that's a great solution to tie, the farm gate price or the ranch gate price to some part of the downstream price, whether it's box beef or, retail. You've got to generate the will, the recognition of the problem better. And I know RCAF and, certainly I have too for years been trying to do that, but we were, outmatched by the free market, free trade, Wall Street lobby that doesn't recognize market failure or in places where the market is misplaced. And so, what's the basis? You've got to show, some consensus that, there's the market has failed unless you're going to be breaking up the packers, which we've tried for years and maybe we can, but it's a low percentage play. You've got to have something to fix market failure like you do in, rural, electrical utilities or something, for rural America health, for rural America social health, for rural America economic health, that sort of thing. So I think it's a great fix, but to make the case to a wider audience than you have before based on national security, rural economic security, something that even traditional opponents could even buy into, would be great.
Michael, I always enjoy your insightful presentations. I wish you taught at most of our major universities, taught a econ class. My question's pretty basic. On the mainstream ag media, farmers for free trade, and who are they? Do you know who's behind that group? I mean, your philosophy with CPA is 180 degrees. And then second question, the effort that was thwarted to get out of the WTO, but who is Farmers for Free Trade? And then the WTO question.
Ask the WTO question again.
Well, what's your position as with CPA on the WTO? There was an effort in Congress to withdraw, and Nancy Pelosi and others pushed that back.
Right. Well, you know that I suspect but don't know that Farmers for Free Trade are funded by, the industries, the globalist ag sector industries, from the processors to the equipment makers and that sort of thing. I suspect but don't know. But you know that it's not farmers taking checks out of their, corn sales or their soybean sales or their cattle sales for this. You know, it's big money doing it. So it's AstroTurf. Farmers for Free Trade is most likely AstroTurf. So ask the WTO. The CPA position is we are very supportive of what the USTR is doing in not allowing the renomination and the reappointment, rather, of dispute settlement body members, the judges, because they have gone beyond the WTO agreement in interpreting cases and turned the WTO agreement into a living document that they can expand the rights and expand the obligations beyond that which Congress agreed to in 1994. They make stuff up, in other words, rather than interpreting it as a contract within its four corners, including the the striking down of cool as WTO unlawful. There's nothing in the agreement that said you can't label beef and pork as the country of origin. They made it up. So now the WTO appears to be on track to die a slow death. Now that could change, but there's a lot of agreement that the dispute settlement body has gone too far. For us at CPA, we're concerned also that the WTO, too much of our economic decisions are hindered by bureaucrats global bureaucrats in Geneva that don't like the U.S. or just believe in a borderless world irrationally. And so we want a situation where if we have an industrial strategy or an agro-industrial strategy or a national interest, we do it. We do it based on domestic law. We don't ask them whether may I at the WTO. And if it's in contravention of that WTO agreement, then they have to change. But we don't have to, because we have to protect our national interests.
What would you see as being the effects, both short-term or long-term, or, with the various agreements and things, if Trump just slapped a freeze on beef imports for under the Emergency Powers Act?
Well, I suppose you'd see, that's an economic analysis. You obviously see a lot of, first you see front running, just as we did in steel and aluminum. That was a tariff. So you got tariffs, quotas, and an all-out freeze. So those are your choices. And you chose the freeze of imports, none. So tariffs and quotas are a lesser degree of that. You saw a lot of front running because they said, okay, we're going to do this in 30 days, 60 days, 90 days. So everyone's shipping heavy and driving the price down. So you'd at first see a reduced domestic market share, and then it would go into place. And you see, if it was fully enforced, you see 100% domestic market share. And then you just have, the question of whether the domestic production is sufficient for domestic consumption, which I think the answer right now is no, because domestic consumption exceeds production. So you'd want to, but that's what happened. You'd have a price go up at the farm gate because you wouldn't have imported cattle suppressing prices. It would go up quite a bit. If you did a quota, it would be a lesser degree of that.
Excuse me. Anyone else got a quick question for Michael before we let him go? Well, seeing none, Michael, as always, thank you for being with us. Thank you for your thoughtful insight, and thank you for what you're doing to help our industry.
Have a great dinner tonight.